students, this is a lesson on absolute value. Specifically today, we are going to learn about how to determine the absolute value of a rational number and also how to demonstrate absolute value using a number line. So if we take a look at this comic over here, you'll see that in the chair, we're at a blood bank, and we've got inside the chair, we have a variable, the variable A, with these two bars on the side. These two bars are the symbols that we use for absolute value. And we're going to talk about that today. And we'll get back to the comic and what it means later. So you should have your notes in front of you, and we're going to talk about definitions for absolute value, and also we're going to learn how to plot absolute value on a number line. So absolute value, the definition, the absolute value of an integer, of a number, of an integer, or any number for that matter, is the distance that number is from 0 on a number line. In other words, it's the number of steps from 0. So if we think about the distance between each number as being steps. And what's really important here is the absolute value of any number is always going to be positive. It's always positive. So I have a number line here, and you're going to want to draw some number lines today, either on your paper or your dry erase board to practice as we go through the lesson. So in this number line, I have, let's say we look at the number 4. The number 4, if we look for its absolute value, we're going to look at the distance it is from 0. And the distance the number 4 is from 0 is 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 4 spaces from 0. So we would say that the absolute value of 4 is equal to positive 4. Now what if we have a negative number? Let's instead look at negative 4. So let's look at the number negative 4. If we want to find the absolute value of negative 4, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to look at the distance the number is from 0. It's 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces from 0. So the absolute value of negative 4 is also 4. Because the absolute value of any number, just like we have in our definition, it's always going to be positive. When we look at how far we are in distance from something, we don't give distance in miles by positive or negative numbers. So if I'm looking at how many miles I am from school, I might say, even though I am south of the school, which would be below or a negative, if I'm 22 miles from school, I would still say, I wouldn't say I'm negative 22 miles from school. I would say 22 miles. So if I was north of school and I was 22 miles north of school, I would also say that's a positive number. So be thinking of absolute value as a distance. And when we talk about distance, when we give distances, distances are positive. And absolute value is always positive. So here we have another picture, and we have another example of absolute value on a number line. So you can see we have absolute value of negative 3 is 3, and the absolute value of positive 3 is also 3. And we read this as, again, the absolute value of negative 3 is 3. And if you look over here, our negative 3 is 3 spaces from 0. So the absolute value is a positive 3. Same thing with positive 3. We read this as the absolute value of positive 3 is 3. So the distance that positive 3 is from 0 is also 3 spaces. And we can verify this with hops as well. So you can see that I hopped 3 times to get from 3 to 0, and I also hopped 3 times to get from -3 to 0. See how -3 and 3 are both 3 spaces, that should be 3, are both 3 spaces away from 0 on the number line. They are both the same distance away from 0. So even though these are two different numbers, they have the same absolute value because absolute value is always positive. So now we're going to practice finding the absolute value using a number line. So what I would suggest that you do is to draw a number line for yourself as we go through these problems together. So the first problem we have here is find the absolute value of -5. So what I would do is I would find -5 on the number line. So here I have -5. If I want to know the absolute value of -5, I'm going to look at the distance that it is from 0. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces from 0. Therefore, the absolute value of -5 is going to be +5. Even though it's a negative number, our absolute value is always positive. Let's take a look at another example. Over here we have the absolute value of +4. So now I'm going to find +4 on my number line. It's over here. I'm going to circle it. And now again I'm looking for the absolute value. So I'm going to look at how far it is, and this time I have to go to the left to find out how far it is from 0. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 4 spaces away from 0. Therefore, the absolute value of +4 is going to be +4. Now notice with the first example, we changed the sign of the number. When we have absolute value of a negative, it turns to positive. But when we have the absolute value of a positive, it remains positive because absolute value is always positive. Now, we can look at absolute value in terms of integers, but we can also look at absolute value with fractions, decimals, and percents. So we have this example here. If I wanted to find the absolute value of -1/2, I could also use the number line. So I'm going to take this number, -1/2, and I'm going to plot -1/2 on the number line. It would be here between, I'm going to put an arrow to it, -1/2 would be between 0 and -1. Now I'm going to look for the distance. How far is -1/2 from 0? You can see that it's not quite a hop. It's only half of a hop. So the distance between, or the absolute value of -1/2 would be the distance it is from 0, and that would be 1/2 of a hop. So again, this is going to be a positive number, which is 1/2. Now let's look at the second example over here to the right with another number, and this is actually going to be an integer because if you simplify 14 over 2, you're actually finding the absolute value of 7 because 14 divided by 2 is 7. So if I plot the number 7 on the number line, 7 is right here, and I look for the distance between 7 and 0, I'm going to find it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 spaces. So the absolute value of 7 is going to be a positive 7. And it remains positive because absolute value is always positive. So that's how we use a number line to find the absolute value of both positive and negative numbers. We can also use a number line to compare numbers that are absolute value or not absolute value. So we have this example here. If we were to compare 2 and the absolute value of negative 5, we have 2 right here. Okay? The absolute value of negative 5, we have to think of it as absolute value. We're not going to think of it as negative 5. We're going to think of it as the absolute value of negative 5. And the absolute value of negative 5 is equal to positive 5. And we have that graphed right here. So if we're comparing the two numbers, we can see that 2 is actually less than the absolute value of negative 5 because it's to the left of negative 5. So even though negative 5 is a smaller number than 2, when we look at the absolute values, it is farther from 0 to the right than 2 because it's a positive value. Now let's try some of these examples on our own. Here we are going to complete, the directions are to complete each statement using greater than, less than, or equal to. And remember, we are comparing their absolute values. If there are the two bars with the number inside, we are comparing absolute values, not the actual value of a number. So if we look at the first example, and you can see at the bottom I've drawn a number line. And you should use a number line as well. I'm comparing the absolute value for this first example of negative 4. I'm comparing that to the absolute value of negative 5 and 5/10. So I'm going to place the first number on my number line. Absolute value of negative 4. I'm going to go to negative 4. But negative 4 is not what I'm comparing. I'm comparing the absolute value of negative 4. So I'm actually going to plot my point here. Because the absolute value of negative 4 is going to be equivalent to positive 4 because absolute value is always positive. I'm going to do the same thing with the absolute value of negative 5.5. So the absolute value of 5.5 would also be positive because absolute value is always positive. So I'm going to go to my number line and I'm going to plot a point at positive 5.5 because the absolute value of negative 5.5 is actually going to be a positive number because it represents the distance from 0. So we could say that we can see that the negative 4, the absolute value of negative 4 is less than the absolute value of negative 5.5. So the symbol that we would use to compare the two numbers would be a less than symbol. The reason being is the absolute value of negative 4 is 4. The absolute value of negative 5.5 is 5.5. And when we change both those numbers to positive values, because we're dealing with absolute value, we would say that 4 is less than 5.5. We can do the same thing with the other examples. This one here, negative 1.1 we're comparing that to the absolute value of negative 1 7/10. Now we can always use our number line, but another tool that we could use is our Desmos calculator. Absolute value is a calculator skill. We are allowed to use our calculators when we are comparing absolute values. So to demonstrate how to use the Desmos calculator to calculate and compare absolute value, I'm going to actually bring in my Desmos calculator. And we're going to look at some of the tools that you can find on the calculator. So the first thing I want you guys to take a look at is this tool here. You can see, just like in our comic in the beginning, we have absolute value sign. We have the two lines with the variable inside, and that's what we're going to use for absolute value. So if I were to compare the absolute value of negative 1 1/2 to the absolute value of negative 1.7, I'm going to use this absolute value button. So I'm going to click on the absolute value, and you're going to notice that the bars show up. Now I can simply put the number inside, and I can put in my fraction 1 1/2. So I'm going to click on my 1. To put in a fraction, I have to click on that cursor. I'm going to click on the A over B, which is the key that allows us to type in fractions. Let me try this again. Oops. Actually, it's helpful. I'm making a mistake some of you may make. I forgot. The best way to do this when you're using a mouse is to probably put the fraction in first. So I'm going to go ahead and put in 1 over 2 for the 1/2, and I'm going to click my cursor to the left of the fraction, and then I'm going to put in my whole number. So you can see I now have this in decimal form, and it has changed the number. Oh, that's a negative also. The negative, what you're going to use for negative is going to be that subtraction sign. So now I have negative 1 1/2 represented inside the absolute value sign, and over here I see the solution. Now if I want to compare this to another number, I'm going to use my arrow to go to the next number, and now I'm going to compare it to the absolute value of negative 1 7/10. So again, I'm going to use my absolute value symbol, and I'm going to put in, this time correctly, my negative sign, 1 7/10. And you can see that it gives us a value of 1.7. So that's how you can use the Desmos calculator to compare or to calculate the absolute value of numbers. So now I can take these values and put them back over here. So we found that the absolute value of negative 1.5, or negative 1 1/2, is going to be, as a decimal, 1.5. And the absolute value of negative 1.7 is going to be positive 1.7. And I know that 1.5 is a value that is less than 1.7. Let's take a look at another example where one of the numbers has an absolute value sign and the other doesn't. So let's take a look at this example here. Notice that the first number is 25 hundredths, and the other number inside the absolute value symbol is negative 1/4. Let's try and use the Desmos calculator again to compare these values. I'm going to click my calculator. Now this one is already calculated for us, isn't it? It's already 0.25. There's no absolute value sign. It's already a positive number. But let's look at this number here. Let's practice putting this in using our Desmos calculator. So I'm going to click on the absolute value of A. I'm going to click on the A over B, the fraction key. But first, let's put our negative. I'm going to put in the A over B, and I'm going to type in 1 over 2. I'm sorry, 1 over 4. There we go. So now it matches what I have, and the absolute value of negative 1 over 4, you can see, is 25 hundredths. So the absolute value of negative 1/4 is actually going to be the same as 0.25. So I'm going to go back, and I'm going to put in the symbol I used to compare the two numbers, which is equal. I'd like you to go back after our lesson today and try some of the other examples. And now that you've learned how to calculate and compare absolute value using a number line, as well as the Desmos calculator, you should be able to meet this objective.